Welcome to this week's LinkedIn Live event. Today's topic is the sales framework for non-sales professionals, and this is the second in a mini-series of now what'll be 4 episodes. I landed on this framework based on years of experience and exposure to a variety of sales frameworks, methodologies, and processes, including the transition from in-person selling to online selling, and now we're in what appears to be a hybrid where those two are coming in together more and more. Now, for this series, I'm distinguishing between framework, methodology, and process, as the sales framework provides the overall structure and guiding principles for a sales team, encompassing both the sales methodology, the approach and strategies used to sell, and the sales process, the specific steps taken to move a lead through the sales funnel. With that in mind, I'm providing a framework that can work with any sales process. The steps of the in-person sales process are the same across a variety of versions of training and offers and sales disciplines. The Dale Carnegie sales course was a standard for many years, if not decades, and it had the sequence of attention, interest, desire, conviction, and close. Now, this may be familiar to you because you probably heard it as attention, interest, desire, and action. And that action would be the call to action. And this came into being around the turn of the century because of online sales. So I like to stay focused on that conviction step because it's where the emotions get involved. It often creates the urgency that we often need to keep the person from putting it off. Now, the reason I'm providing a specific framework for owners, leaders, and executives who also choose to sell is because our world is not like that of a traditional salesperson's experience. We all find ourselves selling to people who are not buyers, or at least not typical buyers. So the path may be lengthened, it may be more choppy, and it may seem to be circular sometimes. In addition, salespeople are often constrained to certain requirements. There are typically quotas which put pressure on selling right now. There's nothing wrong with the urgency. It's important, especially for the sales team. But the owner might be seeking to sell in a non-buying situation that may require more patience, maybe prioritizing the long-term relationship over a right-now sale. Think of someone deciding to have a custom home built, how iterative that process could be before they decide to put a deposit down. This is that feeling out process, and it puts it into a framework that can be used regardless of the length of your sales cycle. In last week's session, I laid the foundation with the focus on why it's essential for owners and leaders to look at human needs in the selling process and how it aligns with decision making. We talked about the Maslow's hierarchy of needs, we talked about the 6 human needs, and we talked about self-determination theory that brings it together into autonomy, competence, and relatedness. And the outcome is intrinsic motivation, meaning people are getting that motivation from inside, from the act itself, rather than some extrinsic incentive or reward or connection. Now, today, we move from concept to execution in the first half of the in-person sales sequence. I'll start with pre-call preparation. So before you even get on a call or enter a conversation, your internal state, clarity, and preparation have to be in place. They determine how you show up. So it's your state, physiology, mindset, and energy that set the tone for success. I'll also talk about why practice is important. Now, it may seem like a no-brainer, but there's a perspective that I don't see covered very often in sales training as to why this practice is important. You may think of it as role-playing, but I'm going to make some distinctions as we get into the material. Once in the sales framework, we want to frame the call. Now, this is where you set the intention and create an environment where trust and credibility are established. It's more than just rapport. From the very beginning, you're building rapport, moving into know, like, and trust, and then connection, and then repeat. We're going to keep doing that because you have to move deeper and deeper into getting the emotional reasons why this person is going to buy. This is not a simple, hey, I like the picture on your wall, and then mirroring the prospect. It's taking control of the situation in a way that the prospect feels you're aligned with their interests, not because of some technique, but because you really are. And they feel it. From there, we'll get into the most important part of a sales framework, fact finding. Now, typically, and in my framework is one step, but I break it into two parts because selling is not telling, asking is, and selling is serving. And in order to serve, we have to know what the needs are, and that's why the fact finding is so important. So while you're working through the framework, you're also earning the right to ask deeper questions, more personal questions, entering into the person's private life, if you will. So we all have a public persona, we have a private persona, and then the one that's out of scope here is the secret persona. We don't need to get into that to make the kind of sales that we're talking about. But I think you have to get into the private persona because you have to tap into that level of emotion. If you're familiar with the quality vernacular, we talk about asking the question why 5 times. And if you've done that, you'll know that it's about 2.5, 3 questions into why that you are now at a place where these people have not thought about that before. And that's what you're looking for. The eyes may go back and forth. They'll kind of shift. They may flush a little bit because they're having to answer a question that they've never answered before. In real time, you're observing them recognize that this is very important. That's where you need to get, and you have to have the alignment with them. You have to have the at least implied permission to be able to get into that level of questioning. Next week, I'll get into the demonstration and moving past objections as we pull it all together into a sustainable framework. As you adopt additional sales skills, you'll be able to insert those into the framework because the framework is flexible and consistent with best practices. To wrap up, I'll add a 4th event in the series to deal with the internal game. We have to master the internal game if we're going to be effective in the external. And that gets into personal leadership and agency, which is essential for us to stay present, engaged, and being able to return to a growth mindset if we ever get knocked off course. And I mean returning to a growth mindset instantaneously. So we'll talk about some of that as we get into next week's event, but certainly when we get into mastering the internal game. Right, so let's jump into the framework. I'll lay this out as a roadmap, and that'll give us a track that we can run on. And I'm going to start with the pre-call process. And this is not rocket science. We know that when we have to do something, when we have to speak before an audience, whatever it is, we want to enter that situation with some preparation. We want to have the right mindset. And this is what I was talking about as a business owner. You could come from working on solving some major problem right into a sales situation. And when that happens, we don't want to bring that baggage from the prior situation in with us. So we have to have some way of getting ourselves in the right frame of mind or the right state. And I'm not going to tell you what state you need to be in, whatever state that is. But to get into that state, if you've looked at watched any of my content, you know I talk a lot about the subconscious and our neural pathways, etc., and conditioning. We can actually condition in the state that we want. You can Google Tony Robbins' 𝗨, and that 𝗨 is a great example of how you can condition in the steps. So he takes this clap, yes, 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 and then with a big whoa, yes. And if you do that several times in a row, you can create this heightened state, right? This heightened energy level. You can also do it like after if you do intervals, maybe do some really hard intervals. If you like running, some sprints after some sprinting, or maybe so actually called fart licking, where you run up and down like on a trail. You run up and down hills and you do side hits, and it's energizing, right? Invigorating. And that point takes you to the state. And then what you do is a move. You put in a move, an anchor. And mine is yes. And it's very, very quick. But I did that by conditioning that high state and then yes. Conditioning, yes. And now if I have to step into a sales situation, no matter what I'm coming from, it's always going to be a yes. Now, we'll do that before I start speaking online. Yes. And what it does is it triggers that state. Now, you can also do that in an opportunistic way. You win an event. Maybe you're in some athletic thing and you win and you're happy about it. You can just keep reinforcing it, and then you can bring it on right away. The first time you use it, it may not happen. You may have to do a little bit more. You may have to jump around a little bit. But eventually you'll get to the point where it's just a quick yes, and you're ready to go into motion. And typically salespeople do that at the beginning of the day, and then they just carry it through. But as a business owner who's wearing different hats, I bring that out. The next one is physiology. Now we all know that we've all seen the numbers that say 7% of communication is words, 38% is the nonverbal cues, etc., and then 55% is physiology. So it's very important. But what people might miss is that physiology can set us up for fight or flight. In other words, it can prime us to be more susceptible to a stress event, which means your threshold for stepping into fight or flight is less. If you consider that we're making, we're probably running through 30,000 stimulus response cycles a day. And if you're not careful and you're dropping, you're carrying some baggage from prior situations and you're dropping your state, you're dropping your physiology, just by having a slumping, defeated physiology, you're triggering the beginning of that cortisol process where it's essentially a stress response. So physiology is important, and make sure you carry that, even if you don't feel like it. And, they've said, try to feel depressed and have on a smile. And so we've heard about the examples, but people don't think about that. And this, by the way, is why I say practice is very important. It's a little side trip from this diagram I'm doing right now. Salespeople typically do not like role playing. It's just whatever it is. I've never seen a group of salespeople who jump in and, hey, I love role playing, but it's something that works. What's interesting is the big move is not from the role playing and interacting. The big move is actually from practicing the speaking. In other words, you can get a big portion of that done just by practicing on your own, as long as you're verbalizing and using the tonality. What we're doing is the same thing that a sports team does when they do drills. Those drills, it's not about muscle memory, it's nervous system memory. Think about it. It's the neural pathway that triggers the muscle to do the thing. And when it comes to speaking, we're conditioning the neural pathway to get us to say the words the way that we want to say them and then get used to it. An example of deep practice, and I do recommend people practice the opening. 100% practice the opening. You can time it. Now, the way deep practice works, one way you can do it is you can time yourself. Let's say you speak it 2 times in a row and you want to land on an exact time. By doing that kind of deep practice, adding another element, say focusing on landing at that exact time of saying it 2 times in a row with perfection, that deep practice causes the neural pathway, the neurons, to wrap with myelin. I mentioned that last week, and that myelin makes them fire faster and with more accuracy and with more strength, which is basically what people call muscle memory. But we're using this because it has the same effect on our thoughts, our thinking, it has the same effect on our speaking. So physiology is much more important than just, hey, let me get into the right posture. It's practicing so that we are also delivering the way we want to deliver. And then we have the energy. And this is related. Years ago, I read a book and it talked about high energy and low energy. And then it also had a dimension of positive energy and negative energy. And you can just think about a matrix in there where you have high negative energy, right, versus high positive energy versus low positive energy versus low negative energy. So clearly, we want to be in a high positive energy state. But there might be times where low positive energy is more appropriate. When you're doing some fact finding and you're helping the person with introspection, there might be a need to back off a little bit and let them wrestle with it internally. You don't want to be, the typical salesperson, like high energy coming at them if they need to process. And that's how you get into the deeper needs, by letting them work through it and wrestle with it. So just be aware of your energy. It doesn't always have to be high, but it should be positive and it should be appropriate. And then watch out with letting negative energy slip in. And that's again why we do the anchor, because we want to anchor that positive energy, and then we can move it to high and low, but staying in the positive. And then we have mindset. Now, the way to do this, and I already talked about it a little bit with the anchor, is priming. You want to have certain cues for your own priming. we're being primed whether we think it or not, whether we like it or not. When you're online reading the sales letter, there's priming in there. What it's doing is tapping into our cognitive biases. Cognitive bias is a mental heuristic, just a shortcut. But those things cause a lot of problems for us because marketers use them and we end up doing things. Last week I talked about the 7 factors of unconscious influence. Marketers use them like authority, scarcity, reciprocity, and people just do the thing without even thinking about it. So it's a double-edged sword. But since we're being primed all the time, doesn't it make sense for us to take charge of our own priming and start doing that? And of course it does. So you want to look into priming. There's a great book on it, John Bargh, Bargh, Before You Know It. It's a great book on priming. And I talked about physiology. Let me just put an exclamation point behind that. He's done a lot of research. And what he did was he had subjects have a hot cup or a cold cup of liquid in the hand. One set was hot liquid, one set was cold liquid, one set was no liquid. When they had the hot liquid in their hand and then they were faced with a situation, again, you have controls, our research is done, they were more compassionate. They had a more compassionate response than they did when there was nothing in their hand, and certainly more so than when there was something cold in their hand. When there was something cold in their hand, like carrying a cup of iced tea, iced with ice in it, they were less likely to have a compassionate response. That really got my attention. And for decades, I paid attention to the cognitive biases, and I understood priming, but not at that level. And then I made the connection that that's because it's the neural pathways. We got 100 billion neurons. Each of those neurons interacts with thousands and thousands of other neurons. And when you do the permutations on that, you can see it's just the numbers off the charts. But those neurons, it's our nervous system. And so warmth is warmth. And that's not John Bargh speaking, that's me saying it. But warmth is warmth, and because that carries through to the other neural pathways and triggering and associations, that's the word I should say, associations, it causes the compassionate response. Really fascinating. It tells you how important priming is in the sales process or any kind of communication, leadership, etc. Priming is very important. Let's say that we have a framework, and then you could think of it as a roadmap. And on this roadmap, the first step that we have is the pre-call, which I just spoke about. That's making sure you're in the right state, reviewing the customer notes that you have. And this is going to be real important when you get into 2 and 3 sales calls later, because you always want to have that step of going back and looking at the notes. So we have the pre-call. I'm not going to spend too much time on that. And then we have the next one is the rapport. As I said, there's no rocket science here. Every sales presentation that you come across is going to have these steps of rapport and then fact-finding. But in addition to the rapport step, we want to have an alignment step. We want to make sure we're aligned, and we want to make sure we're in the right conversation. So we confirm. What we're doing here is pre-qualifying. But rather than think of it as pre-qualifying yes or no, which I know there's sales managers who are very, very big on pre-qualifying to protect the salesperson's time. And then there are others who don't want to pre-qualify or qualify because they don't want to lose prospects. We all know people who look like they didn't want to buy and then they ended up becoming a buyer. So I get the two sides of that. But the way I use it here is that in this confirmation step, we're making a decision. We're making a choice on the fly very quickly. And this whole point can take 5 minutes. I don't think there needs to be a lot of time spent on rapport. If they know you're there to talk about the product or service, the small talk, most business owners don't need to do a lot of small talk anyway. Obviously, if they're socializers, they're going to carry that a little bit further. But you as the salesperson do not need to carry it. A great, hey, how's it going? What's the weather like for you? Or how's your day been? Or how's your week been? That quick question is enough to provide the quote unquote small talk. Small talk is the price we pay for having relationships. So enough is enough. Once you do it, you've got enough. You check that box, so to speak. I'm not talking about relationship building here. I'm talking about a sales framework. But in that section with that information, you're making a choice. Do I continue? Because the next step will be fact finding. Do I continue? Because once you continue down that path, you're asking some questions that are going to lead to building on emotion, and that's going to feed what comes out in the sales demonstration. You're basically building your presentation real time by asking these questions. The other thing that you may end up doing is delay and set follow-up. So in this case, if there's alignment and they confirm that this is the right conversation, but they're kind of busy or they're not really ready to talk about it or they're preoccupied, we may want to schedule a formal day in the future, especially as a business owner. Let's say you're networking and you do this step. You probably don't want to do the fact finding at that time. So this would be a good time to schedule something out into the future. This is one of the things that makes a owner sales call different than a salesperson sales call, because it might be something that's impromptu and then you're turning it into a sales call. So delay and schedule next week. But even if you have an appointment, even if you had a Zoom appointment or whatever, and you're on Zoom and you do how's your week going, and they say it's been hectic, I've got this going on and this fire and that thing and this thing going on, maybe asking, so let me just ask you a question, and I'm just curious. If there was a solution that met all of your needs, would you consider yourself in market, or is this something that you'd be looking way out into the future? All you're doing is getting a sense of, do you schedule something next week, or do you delay and revisit? I'm big on this because I'll go back to using canned sales presentations. And canned sales presentations, and it's well designed. It's been tested and proven. It has leverages all the heuristics. It primes and primes and primes. When you use that kind of a presentation, and if you ever bought a timeshare, or someone sold you a vacuum cleaner in your home, or you bought some fire alarm, something like that, when you can sit through that entire presentation, your conviction is so high. It's very similar to if you ever find yourself reading one of those sales letters online, and it's like the more you read, then you find yourself wondering what's the price going to be, and wow, I really want this, and you even start thinking in your mind the price range that you might be a buyer, and it's literally priming you. Well, that's what good sales presentations do, and that's what this framework is doing. This framework is designed to put you in charge of building that kind of a presentation on the fly for yourself. This is why this step to me is very important, because I don't want to embark on that emotional journey, because you don't get to do it again. That fact finding gets into some deep thinking for the person, emotional stuff, and you're probably not going to be able to do it again if you do it now and they're not ready to buy. So we have hard stops. It doesn't mean you can't keep going, but you want to make sure you do a hard stop and a transition before you get into fact finding. Now, once you're into fact finding, we have part 1 and part 2 before we get into the next hard stop and transition. We've all heard that when you're starting the sales process, you want to use open-ended questions. But we don't want to just keep asking open-ended questions thinking the person is going to say, you know what, I'm ready to buy. What you want to do is, you are working through this funnel, and not to be confused with the sales funnel, the online selling funnel, but the concept is not that different. You're starting with a very broad base of open-ended questions. If you think of it like this, we have our open-ended questions, and those open-ended questions go from lifestyle, what's going on in their life, to service-related or product-related. And you want to do that fairly quickly. You may, like I said, asking how's your week going, depending on whether it's the beginning of the week or the latter. That could be your question. And that could be your one lifestyle open-ended question. From there, you want to start getting into, so last time we talked, or I saw that you did, whatever your segue is that still something that's important to you? Or did I read that right, that this is something that you're thinking about? Now, that's sort of a yes or no question, right? But it could also be an open-ended question. What are some of the things that are coming up to the top of your list when you think about this space? That's an open-ended question that gets you into the starting towards the right fact-finding. The next thing I want to do, though, is either-or questions. I think one of the challenges is that people get lost in rapport. They just keep going for more and more and more rapport. You're going to be building rapport across the entire roadmap. You're going to go from rapport to know, like, and trust to connection and repeat. So this is not, you don't want to drown in rapport land right here. You want to keep building rapport by asking questions, listening to the answer, acknowledging them, reflecting back what you're hearing, and then asking another question that's related. Making the person feel heard. This is the relatedness part of self-determination theory. You want to make sure that they feel heard and that they feel seen. So the either or questions are a great tool to go from open-ended questions to either or, and it moves the pace along. By asking the either or, you're directing it. So rather than, sometimes you ask an open-ended question and they go off on tangents, the either ors bring it down. And then from the either or questions, you want to have some evaluation questions to kind of get their sense. Evaluative. So you might ask, so you have a such and such right now. How's that been working for you? What are some of the things you like about it? So it's still sort of an open-ended question, but it's more evaluative is the point, because you're starting to build this idea of bracketing. If you look at artillery and mortars, they do this, they fire long and then they fire short, and then they may fire long. There's a forward observer watching this, and then they fire short. Now you have drones and technology, but the concept is that you long, short, you're bracketing and then fire for effect. And that's what we're doing here. We're sort of getting a sense of where they are. When you ask a person a question and they give you an answer, you really don't know which way they were going as they arrived at that answer. Were they coming from this direction? Were they coming from that direction? Are they stepping into the space? Are they stepping out of the space? So you want to ask more questions to bracket in and have your understanding match theirs. And this is not a clinical thing. This is you use it as a rapport and a know, like, and trust and a connection step. You're letting them experience you and you're experiencing them in a non-threatening situation. We're not asking them about sales. You're asking them questions that, in addition to giving you that information, it does an important thing. It takes them out of the habitual response. One of the things I like to do in this fact finding is we want to go 5 levels deep, if you can. If you go back to quality content, we talk about asking why 5 times. That came from the Japanese total quality management days, Kaizen, asking the question why 5 times. And if you get in the practice of doing this as a leader, as an owner, asking your employees, team members, associates, customers, ask 5 times why. And it's not why, obviously. It's, that's an interesting perspective. I'm curious, how'd you get to that point of view? That's one why. Was there a reason that's important? Why that and not something else? That's the second why. Going why 5 times, and what you're looking for is this thing where maybe their eyes go or they look down, they pause, their body language shifts, because they're coming out of their habitual responses. Most people don't have more than 3 habitual responses. Once you get past that 3rd habitual response, you're actually getting into what's really going on. And if you consider that we make 30,000 decisions a day, our lives are run 95% by habit, you can see why it's so important to get out of that. You want to break through that barrier and really talk to what's in their heart and what speaks to their purpose. So we have open-ended questions, we have either-or questions, and then we have evaluative questions. So we're going deeper down into that funnel, but at the same time, we're building rapport, we're building know, like, and trust, and we're building connection. All right, so now, and that's all happening in this fact-finding step. And then you're going to take that information and go deeper as we get into the part 2. So this is part 1, and this is part 2 of the fact-finding. I like to say telling is not selling, asking is. So we want to be asking questions, and we want to not be thinking about ourselves, we want to be thinking about them. Your product knowledge should be such that once you have it figured out, you know exactly where to go. What I want to do is add some structure. So the first step was rapport and qualify. It's pretty standardized. It's a short 5-minute thing that happens. You can use basic communication principles. There's ORS, O-A-R-S. Open-ended questions followed by an acknowledgement and affirmation, followed by rephrasing it and then summarizing. But I would say take the A, and instead of just I would do both the acknowledge and affirm. And you have to mix it up because you're going to be asking a lot of questions. You're going to be getting different answers. And you don't want to be like a robot. And you don't want to just keep firing back with another question. A lot of times when people are starting out with this approach, they're pretty quick on the next question, or they have sort of a canned awesome. And then they keep asking, oh, that's great. And they ask another question. You want to build in this acknowledgement step because people have to feel heard. They want to be seen. So again, ORS is open-ended questions, acknowledge and affirm, restate, and then summarize. And I would take restate to the next level. Not every time, but certainly in some cases. And this is going to help you with rapport, the know, like, and trust. And it's going to help you suss out some of what's really going on underneath. So it goes like this. Instead of just rephrasing, in fact, you don't even rephrase. You just go into, wow, that must have been confusing for you. Wow, I bet that was frustrating. Man, what a big disappointment, huh? You are inferring the likely emotion that goes along with what they're telling you. And they'll correct you if you're wrong, but you'll get better and better. And this forces you to listen. And you're not just a robot asking questions. You're actually engaging, and you're trying to feel what's going on. It's out of scope for today, but this is where your mirror neurons are going to come in. You may have read the book Blink by Malcolm Gladwell. He talks about thin slicing. And that thin slicing, part of it, I believe, is being helped along with the mirror neurons. There are other factors as well, because you have 5 senses where you're taking in information. But certainly these mirror neurons, because they're the ones that help us have empathy. Remember, the mirror neurons are where if the person you're talking to raises their arm, the same areas in your brain light up in theirs, even though you're not moving your arm at all. And that helps you understand why mirroring and matching works well for rapport. Again, out of scope here. So ORs, open-ended questions, affirm and or acknowledge, restate or reflect, and then you have the summarize. There's another one, acknowledge, personalize, question. So ORS actually comes more from the consulting and the coaching world, whereas this APQ I think is more related to sales. I got it from 𝗏 So 𝗏, lead gen and sales with an ampersand. 𝗏, lead gen and sales. She uses APQ, and again, it's a great way to put that in between their answer and your question. So APQ is acknowledge, personalize, and then question. And the personalize is similar to the reflecting, but whereas the reflecting is going back to the emotion, the personalizing is talking about something that they answered before. For example, let's say you're going into the evaluation questions, or you're in the either or. They give you an answer, and you can connect that answer back to something they've told you before. Again, this shows that you're listening, and it's not about a technique to show you're listening. You have to actually be listening. You have to actually care. But then these things help you out. And again, I think the big advantage is that they keep you from going rapid fire with more and more questions, and they force you to pause. If you have a canned presentation, that becomes habitual. You're operating out of the subconscious, and that's fast, right? 95% of what we do is by habit, and that gets into that speed, and you want to slow this thing down. By doing these techniques, whether it's acknowledge, personalize, question, or open-ended, affirm, reflect, summarize, it's forcing you to engage consciously. You have to be engaged to do that. You're coming up with this on the fly. You can't be checked out. So again, these are tools that I think will help you. And 𝗏 does a really good job of modeling some of what I'm talking about today. You can find her on TikTok, Instagram, and YouTube. Either look for 𝗏, lead gen, and sales with an ampersand. And just check out some of her content. She demonstrates a good cadence as she's walking through some of the sales. And also she has some great philosophy. So I think it's very much aligned with the framework. Her focus is on social media and people in the sales role. This framework, as you know, is for owners and leaders who are also choosing to sell. So they're not going to be in a typical sales environment all the time. So check her out. I think it'll be a good review for you as you prepare. And she's also a sales mentor. So if you're looking for somebody to help you with your team or yourself, then you may want to start there as well. Self-determination theory tells us people need relatedness. They need to be seen. This is the intrinsic motivation. You're making the sales talk interesting for them because you're tapping into their intrinsic motivation with the relatedness piece. So you take the answer, you personalize it. I can see now why such and such is important to you. Or, that's interesting you do that. That goes right along with your blah, blah, blah. You're personalizing it and letting them know. And then you ask them another question. One of the things that's consistent with good fact-finding practices is to ask another question. What I want to do here, though, is give you a framework within the framework, so to speak. This is decades old, and I've said many times that our brain is over 100,000 years old, so just because something came from last century doesn't mean it's no longer effective. The brain is well over 100, it's hundreds of thousands of years old, some parts of it millions of years old, so the things work the same. If you go back and look at the New Thought era, 1850 to 1940 or so, where the philosophers and psychologists, they were coming out with all this information, it all lines up. What's different today is that we have the measurement tools available to us and the scanning tools available to us to see which parts of the brain are lighting up, etc. And it helps us to understand more deeply and more accurately what's actually going on with what's called the subconscious. So we have situation, and these are questions, situation questions. These are open-ended. So you can think of this spin model as you're working through. And I would say the first one, situation and problem questions. So you ask enough situation questions to feel like you can go into the problem, and then you ask enough problem questions to feel like you can go into implication questions, and that's the next one. Now, what he talks about in the book Spin, first half talks a lot about sales training, but then he gets into this situation, problem, implication, and needs/payoff. He takes the problem, and this gives you explicit information, but you're using this deeper type of questioning to also understand what are the implications, and then you start asking implication questions, and that's real powerful. So that gives you a good picture of the part one of the roadmap. I'm going to now walk through some examples so you can see how it works in action, and we'll start with the pre-qualify step. And I'll use a combination of automobile sales and generic software. It doesn't really matter what product or service you're selling. You're going to have to work through and come up with your own questions, but this gives you a guide. And then what I'll do is later on is I'll give you the same process, but I'll do it of talking to your friends about going out to a restaurant to eat. And I do that because sometimes asking these questions can feel awkward because we're in this like sales mode thinking that, I have to be perfect as a salesperson. And we lose sight of the fact that this is just natural conversation. And by saying it in the way that you would to a friend group, it makes it easier for you to make the leap. We fix the physiology, and then we put the words back in, and it seems to work well, especially when we get to what's called yes questions. All right, so starting here with the rapport, you got to get that pre-call qualification done. Remember, we talked about either you're going to delay and schedule, like schedule next week, or you're going to continue now, or you're going to delay and revisit it sometime in the future. And as the owner, this could be a quarter, 3 months away, 6 months away. It could be a milestone. This is much better than chasing somebody after you've closed to them and said that they want to think about it, because you don't know if you have a real buyer at that point. Here, you're not even going to waste your time or theirs doing a presentation until you know that they're ready, financially and mentally. So here we go. We're in this step right here. If this solution solves the challenges that we've discussed, how does that align with your timeline and budget for implementation? Are you in a position to move forward if this meets your needs, or are there other factors that we should consider before diving in? Then we're going to transition to making a decision about moving forward today or putting it off till later. Since this seems to be a good fit, we should schedule a time next week to go through the details in the context of your specific situation. Would Thursday morning work for you? Now that's the one scheduling it into next week. It sounds like this is a priority for you. I suggest we go ahead just to check. Do you have about 45 minutes now to walk through the details? That's going to continue now, but you're first getting alignment that they have the 45 minutes or an hour or whatever it is that's going to take you to go through the steps. It sounds like you have some things to sort out before moving forward. How about we connect in a few weeks to see where things stand? And that's delaying. And this could be the person, well, I need to talk to my spouse. I need to talk to my partner. Yeah, I'm not sure if I'm going to move forward with this. We're waiting for some other things to come through. I'm waiting for some funding to happen. Whatever it is, this moves it out. So you're not going to start the presentation until that milestone is reached. Then we're going to get into the open-ended questions. And again, these are just giving you an idea. You're going to have to work through it yourself. I recommend getting with your team and struggling with it, but come up with some really good questions that everybody aligns on and that you can use repeatedly. What's most important to you when choosing a new vehicle? So this is a very broad, top of the funnel question that I'm going to use to start narrowing it down. And remember, we don't want to get stuck in rapport land. We want to move through these questions. Now, how do you typically use your car during the week? So here I'm looking for, is this a commuting situation? Do they go on trips? Does the car sit a lot? Does the car get driven a lot? And this is going to come into play later because I want to know how many miles they drive. Now, if the person is asking for the top of the line car, you may think that doesn't matter. And maybe it doesn't, but I would like to check. And that's just an example of why some of these questions are the way they are. And I wanted to paint the picture of how we move down that funnel. But we're in control. We know our product, we know our service, and we're asking questions not willy-nilly. We're asking them on a track or a path. What challenges have you experienced with your current applications? I know you've got a couple of them. Are there any specific challenges that come to mind? From there, what we want to do is ask open-ended questions until, if possible, we can get to a point where they're no longer giving pat answers. We like to get to that point past the 3 or 4 levels deep where they're now having to think about the answer. If you don't get there in the open-ended questions, that's okay. We're going to get there with the either or, and that's what comes next. So the either or it makes the conversation more succinct, and it gives us more control because we're framing with the either or, and then they're answering. We're not having to listen to a 5-minute response to an open-ended question. And it also creates commitment because we're framing the either or question. We're getting them to commit to one of those answers or not. So if they say that they like performance driving, they're making a commitment to accept some of the other things that go along with the performance car, or we have to backtrack on that, which is okay. But this is how you end up with a solution that matches what they're most likely to say yes to. Would you prefer a sportier feel with tighter handling, or would a smoother, more cushioned ride be more appealing to you? On the software side, would you rather have a system that automates tasks completely or one that gives you more manual control along the way? Do you prefer a clean, minimalist dashboard for your applications, or is it something with deeper customization that's more appealing? And remember, typically when there's more customization available, it's more complex. So this is why you're trying to work through this now, because you don't want them to become objections. This is how when sales trainers talk about breaking through objections in the fact finding, this is what we're talking about. We're literally using the either or questions to get rid of some objections that would come up later on. To help illustrate what it looks like using the spin model, I'm going to use personal type questions. We're going to use the example of going out to a restaurant because it's something we can all relate to, and you can see how these actually apply. And we're going to start with open-ended questions, then we're going to go into either or, and then we're going to go into the implication. What kind of food are you in the mood for tonight? Obviously open-ended, right? When was the last time we tried something new for dinner? Then you're going to slip into either or. Would you prefer to go somewhere casual or something a little more formal? You're starting to narrow it down, right? Paint a picture. And you're gauging using sensory acuity to see what sparks interest in the person. Is it important to stay close in, or are you okay going somewhere a little bit farther away for variety? And then we're going to slip into the evaluation type questions using either or. How was it the last time we ate at that steakhouse? Was it worth the price? That's more like evaluation. How do you feel about waiting 45 minutes for a table? Is that a deal breaker for you? Let me just go through, my notes here, see if there's anything else I want to cover. Silence. Silence is a big one. Haven't said much about that. We want to have silence in different levels of silence. Pauses, short pauses, longer pauses. But more importantly, do it for a reason. When you see somebody struggling with something, you want to be silent. They're the one on the hot seat, not you. So you could be just twiddling your thumbs while they're trying to figure this out. Another time to use silence is after you ask a closing question or a decision question, because they're wrestling with themselves. And when you start really leaning into this framework, one of the things you'll notice, you're not trying to overcome their objection. What you're doing is helping them overcome their limiting beliefs. When somebody's stepping into the unfamiliar, it's uncomfortable, right? We know the subconscious doesn't like the unfamiliar, it perceives it as a threat. But also people don't like making decisions because they could be wrong. And when they're making a decision about something out into the future, they don't have their 95% of habit to rely on. They're engaging consciously. And the conscious mind, remember, is slower, much, much slower than the subconscious. So they are actually thinking through things, and you have to let them think through that. And when you recognize your role is that you're helping them overcome themselves, takes on a different tack, right? So sometimes you'll just listen. Sometimes you say, tell me more. Tell me what you're thinking about right now. You definitely don't want to rescue them from the hot seat. You want them to be uncomfortable because there's an amount of cognitive dissonance that has to happen before a breakthrough. And if you're selling a transformation product, service, or anything that's going to be a game changer for them, they're stepping into that cognitive dissonance, and you have to allow it to happen. What's the price? They like to ask, how does it work? Whatever. But we're still doing fact finding. So imagine if you're building this model in your mind of what they want, and they're asking you, how much is it going to cost? That's too early. That's a demonstration question. So you want to bypass it with, you don't have to answer the question, but you should respond. And that response is, yes, that's important. There's too many variables still for me to be able to tell it definitively. By the way, how many miles do you typically put on your car in a year? Or, by the way, how many users are you going to have on this application? Or, by the way, are there any other major software applications that you use regularly? Because I have to think about integration. Whatever, just however you want to do that. It's another pre-planned fact-finding question that you could tack on to any bypass. Now, I often say slow it down. And this can have a couple of different dimensions. You can literally slow down your speaking, like to get their attention, or you can slow down the pace by adding more pauses. And I mean both of those. If you should record yourself, especially when you're learning this framework and you're starting to use new types of questions, etc. Record yourself. Use your phone if you can. Just record yourself and see if you're speeding up in certain places. You want to slow it down because they have to soak it in. They are literally unpeeling their own onion, and you're there to help them. Eventually, they're going to get to a sticking point where they reach a point where there's an internal barrier. Maybe it's a belief. Maybe it's some I don't want power going on that makes it hard for them to get past that. You are going to have to help them get over that hump. This is why you're shoulder to shoulder. This is why you're listening to where their resistance points are. And it's why you want to let them wrestle with things. When we get into the objection handling procedure, we're recognizing that the objections are not really objections. It's just they get to put off making this decision that they already know that they should make. They're looking for a confirmation and validation that they should buy, and that's what you provide, which is why I talk about it as a demonstration and a recommendation rather than a close. And then after the recommendation, if they say no or they want to think about it, then we get into obliterating those objections. I already talked about the 5 levels deep. And then the last thing, I've already said that selling isn't telling, asking is. It was actually taught to me. Telling ain't selling, asking is how it was set up originally. But if you think about it, if you're telling, you're not selling. And then the other one is selling is serving. We have to be stepping into this as selling is serving, and telling and selling is asking. And the reason why it's important is you can't serve until you know what their needs are. You don't want to be serving them out of what you perceive without asking them those questions. That's going to be a good place to stop here. Next week, we'll get into the demonstration, recommendation, the close, and then I'll add another episode into the series where we take care of the internal game, to get the internal game right so that we can master the external game. And then next week, Friday morning, we'll do the third in the mini-series, and then I'll add a fourth one, as I said, to get into the internal and external game. All right, we'll see you then.